Go.
Hi, everybody. My name is Will Peters. I'm with Harry Shimugam, and we are going to present to you a little bit about the consulting recruiting process. We just want to take you through the ins and outs of the recruiting process, even during COVID-19 in this difficult time, but hopefully this will be true. This consulting recruiting process presentation will be able to give you an idea for what to expect in any scenario. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Harry and we can get going.
Awesome. Yeah. So we can start off with just a general overview of kind of the recruiting process. And I know generally like a confusing thing for a lot of people is really understanding what the timeline is in terms of what are the distinct steps that need to be done in the recruiting process, as well as when you need to be doing them. And obviously things are right now very fluid with COVID-19. A lot of us aren't even sure who are going to consulting for the summer, if we're going to have internships or not, or what capacity they're going to be in. But this is kind of the general template that we followed for our recruiting process for a normal cycle. Things could obviously be adjusted with the current pandemic, but in general, notice how it's not necessarily a linear progression of steps. Rather, there's a couple things that can be done roughly sequentially, but also pretty simultaneously. So you'll see that kind of throughout kind of the 7 main steps to really have, or 6 if you really think about it, are discernment, networking, resume prep, case prep, actually doing the application, and then interviewing. And then obviously that culminates with getting an offer. And the entire process kind of spans from April to November, but that could be flexible depending on what firms you're applying to and what deadlines and timelines that each firm has. But in general, this is a rough guide of how to be going about things in the sense of starting off with networking and kind of doing your resume prep and case prep, and then actually going through the application and hopefully getting invited for an interview, going through 2 rounds of that, and then getting your eventual offers.
And just to echo what Harry was saying there, I think it's also important to realize that networking is going to look different in different parts of this timeline, as well as the case prep and even the application process. All of it is subject to change depending on where you are and where you're hoping to be. But this is a good representation of just sort of a fluid expectation.
Yeah, just a general guide to follow. So we're going to run through kind of step by step each one of these things, but obviously we'll send these slides out as well. Feel free to come back to the slide at any point just to see kind of a general guide of where you should be or what you should be doing at any given month in this recruiting process. So without further ado, kind of starting off with discernment. This, if you remember, I think this is probably the most important component of the entire recruiting process, in the sense of you want to be doing this at kind of every stage throughout the recruiting process, in the sense of when you're first getting started, think about, what is consulting, making sure you're doing some examination about what that is, what type of consulting you're interested in, what do you want to learn from it? Is consulting right for you? What are the firms that you're interested in? What industries or function areas do you want to be exploring? And also, what is the general kind of the general lifestyle surrounding consulting? Where do you want to be working? What city? Is there anything after your time in consulting that you want to be doing that consulting can potentially set you up for? And there are a lot of different resources for kind of engaging in this reflection and introspection. The CSOM office, as well as the Career Center, has plenty of advisors who are happy to engage in these conversations in terms of examining kind of those 3 questions, right? Of what are you good at? What does the world need you to do? And what's the 3rd question? There's a 3rd question there somewhere.
What brings you joy?
What's that? Yes, what brings you joy?
Yeah.
Also very important. But also either faculty mentors, current and former consultants at some of the firms you'd be looking at. Upperclassmen who've completed consulting internships are phenomenal resources as well, because they've kind of just gone through it. As well as BC alumni who absolutely love Eagles and are happy to help throughout the recruiting process. And we'll talk about networking, but also happy to talk about their experiences at each one of these firms, and often give a pretty, I think, honest representation of what it's like to work as a consultant. And so I know for me personally, kind of going through the process, the sheer amount of conversations that I had throughout the recruiting process was the most important thing for me, in terms of really making sure that I knew why I was doing consulting and making it be an informed decision. And that, I think, kind of served me well throughout the interview process as well.
If I can just add that while this discernment part of the process is highly important, many of you are going to be interviewing for internships and maybe your first job in your career, and it's also just important to remember that a great way to discern whether or not you want to do something is by doing it, and you'll gain a lot of insight through this this first experience with like the industry or the job, the function that you take on. So it's important to recognize that at the end of the day, you have to make a decision at some point, and you'll learn a lot from it, regardless of whether or not it's perfect for you.
Yeah, exactly. Networking. So networking is something I think is, there's a lot of like uncertainty surrounding it for a lot of students kind of going into the recruiting process. In the sense of, you hear like for some industries, like for example, investment banking, recruiting or networking is kind of an essential component, mandatory, if you will, of the recruiting process, in the sense of you need to be kind of going through the machinations of talking to a couple different alums. And that is kind of the bare prerequisite to even getting an interview. I don't think that's necessarily the way to think about networking in consulting recruiting. More so, I think of it as an opportunity to learn more about the firm and to learn more about consulting in general. It's kind of part of that discernment process, if you will. Basically, what you want to be doing is having conversations with as many people at these firms, whether it be recruiters or current employees at various levels, whether it be associate, business analyst, or partners, principals. You want to be having conversations to learn more about the firm and the identity of the company that you're applying to. And in the process, you're also kind of introducing yourself and making yourself more familiar to the people who eventually you might be, working for, might be interviewing for. And so I think a general goal, if, within this larger umbrella of trying to learn more about the firm, a general goal that you can also have is try to get 1 to 2 people at each one of the firms you're applying to, who can advocate for you during the recruiting process. Because for what it's worth, it does end up being a really strong asset to have people who are on your side as you go through the process, especially for some of the firms that come on campus, or some firms that don't recruit on campus as well. These are very, very competitive positions, where you can be having dozens, if not hundreds, of applications for essentially what can be 4 to 5 intern spots, tops in a given class, coming from BC. And so having people who can, beat the drum for you every step of the process is very helpful. And there is a distinction between kind of on-campus and off-campus recruiting, in terms of networking, in the sense of, I think networking takes maybe a more important role in off-campus recruiting, in that if a firm doesn't directly come to BC, making sure that you have people who can still advocate for you at the firm is very important, to making sure that you don't get lost in the quote-unquote online application black hole. But given that, some avenues for networking are, if the firm does recruit on campus, attending on-campus information sessions. A lot of times firms will be tracking interest there. They'll give you a QR code that you can scan at the end as a kind of way of like checking in, so that the firm knows that you're interested in what they have to offer. But also, really kind of seeking out informational interviews and phone calls and coffee chats. And the way that you can do this is through LinkedIn. Straight up connecting with BC alums at different firms you're interested in, sending cold messages. Alums are happy to connect, and they recognize that LinkedIn is a platform that exists for that purpose, and for networking and building those relationships. So definitely take advantage of that and make sure that your LinkedIn profile is updated. But also try to talk to recruiters. Once again, talk to BC alumni, and try to obviously, like, after informational interviews, one way to kind of continue a relationship with a BC alum or someone at a firm is to try to do a practice case with them, or to do a resume review with them. That kind of just shows that you're still engaged with them, and still interested in the firm. And a general tip that I got throughout the process was to end every call with a new contact, asking if there's someone else that you think you should talk to, as a way to kind of continue the process and make it be more iterative. Okay, looking at resume and cover letter prep. So this is a fun little statistic. The average time a recruiter spends looking at a resume is 7.4 seconds. The average time that you'll put into prepping your resume is far, far, far more than that. And it goes for good reason, because if a resume is only in front of a recruiter or an interviewer for a couple seconds, either before your interview or before they offer you the interview, it really needs to pop, and really needs to make sure that you're selling yourself as well as you can in this one piece of paper, which can be reductive and kind of complicated, but there are ways to do that. Some things that are important in the resume. You want to make sure that it's consistent. So, grammar is the bare minimum. There can't be any spelling mistakes, anything like that. But you want to be consistent in the way you format, the spacing between your bullet points, the font, the abbreviations. Those small things kind of really add up to a really professional composite overall. But you want to be very specific too, in terms of what you've done and how you've done it. Whether that means scales, what methods, if there's any distinctions, if you're the first person to do something. And you want to be descriptive in terms of what exactly was done, but also the context, really providing some sense of background for the person who's reading your resume, in the sense of we have all these clubs at BC, but no one really knows what woman in business is unless you contextualize it as it's this organization that provides mentorship. You want to give some idea of what exactly this means in the grand scheme of things. Is an $8,000 budget large or small? You want to be giving some idea of that, and you also want to craft a narrative, I think, in the sense of your resume and the activities that you have shouldn't really necessarily be viewed as a collection of independent activities, but rather kind of a narrative, like a composite of experiences that have led you to want to go into consulting. And that means emphasizing certain elements of it that are applicable to consulting, whether that be problem-solving skills, working in a team, collaboration, a particular set of analyses that can be helpful. You want to really make sure that you're tailoring what you have to the consulting industry in general. And some recommendations and resources for that are, looking at resumes of people who have gone into consulting, just in terms of helping with phrasing your own entries, getting one of those resume templates from the Career Center or from Fulton 315 that can kind of help in making sure that your formatting is consistent all across, and then getting your resume reviewed. We mentioned doing that with BC alums earlier on, but also the Career Center and peer advisors or other upperclassmen are great resources. And if you get started early on this, you have a good resume that you can then kind of pass around and shop around as you go about that networking stage we talked about earlier.
And when you're going through, developing this narrative that Harry's talking about, try to stay away as much as possible from generic buzzwords or fluff that maybe you can't explain. You might get quizzed or grilled on any part of your resume. So if you're going to put it on there, be sure you can talk confidently about it. But also be sure that it's selling yourself and selling your narrative as effectively and as well as possible, just so that it communicates a clear picture of who you are and why you're there.
Awesome. After you've done kind of your resume prep, next is the case interview. And the case interview is like the big scary monster in the recruiting process. It's often viewed as one of the most important hurdles to kind of get over. I personally have in the mindset that if you view it as a hurdle, it's going to be an unmitigated disaster. It's better to view it as an opportunity to kind of learn and pick up skills. Everyone kind of goes through a progression in terms of being ready for doing cases, and you will get better. But what is the case interview? And there's another set of videos that we have on kind of cases that we'd recommend watching to get more detail on that. But basically, you can take a variety of forms depending on the firm, but companies are looking to assess your problem-solving skills and your ability to analyze data and make decisions, and they do this through a case study format. Basically, you'll be presented with some sort of business problem, and you have to kind of walk through both receiving the data and getting the data, and then synthesizing that to make a decision and a recommendation. It's not mandatory to have a business background. Critically, a lot of consulting firms actually love people who aren't business majors because they bring different modalities of thinking into solving a different problem. Rather, what you want to do is be able to demonstrate kind of universally applicable critical thinking skills and structuring and logical thinking that can then be translated to business problems. And one thing that I find can help with translating this like general problem solving skills that BC students have so well into like a more business specific format can be, reading the business section of the New York Times or reading the Wall Street Journal, just understanding what exactly the lingo and vocabulary of the business world is, and then kind of translating your own knowledge and skills into that. In terms of the physical process to prepare for case interviews, we kind of recommend this sequence that, once again, isn't strictly linear. The one thing that we do ask you do first is watch the case interview video sequence. There's an introductory presentation as well as a sample case that Will and I are going to run. Watch that video before kind of doing the remaining steps. And the remaining steps would be, consider buying either Case in Point by Mark Cosentino or Case Interview Secrets by Victor Chang, which kind of have, good strategies for tackling cases, specific frameworks that you might want to start off with, at least to get an understanding of. And, it can also really help with some non-business cases like, how many ping pong balls can fit inside a Boeing 747 is a classic one. But then from that point on, the biggest thing you can do is practice. You want to be getting to a point where you're not just kind of regurgitating frameworks that you're getting from those books. You want to get to a point where you have little small tips and tricks that have worked well for you. And that way, when you do eventually get to game day, you're able to rely on those instead of kind of having a case of nerves or stage fright on the day of your interview. And so the best way to do that is to practice with alums, with contacts at firms, friends, roommates, other people who are going through the recruiting process, even yourself in front of a mirror. And the Carroll School of Management also offers kind of dedicated practice interviews that you can do with case fellows in Fulton 315. So you can set up a meeting with one of us, and we'll be happy to kind of go over a case with you and give you some targeted feedback as well.
And speaking to the volume that it might be useful for you to practice, many people that have gotten these jobs and are working in consulting oftentimes will quote something like 50 to 100 cases that they might have run through in preparation for the case interview. When I first heard those numbers, heard those figures, I thought that was ludicrous. Like, didn't think there was a chance I'd run through 50 or 100 cases. But I honestly think I ran through, between giving cases and doing cases myself, I ran through almost 75 cases in my preparation for the interview. So know that while it sounds like a lot right now, once you start practicing, like, you just start doing them more and more frequently, and you can do so many. And that's how you really get good at going through these interviews.
Yeah. Another thing too is everyone starts off, like, the first case you do is almost always a train wreck, and it's kind of like a fun moment to look back on, just because everyone starts at that point, and that's just because the discomfort of the initial format of a case. But eventually, as you keep doing more and more practice, you get to a point where you think, where you're able to kind of figure out what works for you and what kind of general structures that you can follow in solving the case. All right, so after you've done your case interview prep, now comes the actual application process, and this makes it seem very simple. Like, apply, interview, get your offer, you're done. Obviously, in reality, like, to actually go through that process is very kind of high stakes. It can be a pretty stressful time, but the general process consists of applying either on EagleLink, so BC's kind of like career platform, or the company's online portal. And generally, an application is pretty simple. Just usually consists of a resume, a cover letter, a transcript, and then for some places you get to specify what office you'd like to work in, what city you want to be in for your internship and post grad. And then if you're invited for a first round interview, you usually get an email for that first round interview that can be either on campus, can be at the office in the case of some firms, or it can be like a digital Skype or Zoom interview. And then if that goes well, usually a couple days later, you can get the call for an invitation for the final round interview. And that one is almost always at the office. Notice that it says interviews in plural. Your first round interview at most of my firms was 2 separate interviews, 2 separate case interviews. And the final round interview at some of the firms also took different formats. So you could have a group case, you could have, a group case and an individual case. There's different types of firms, and different firms like to do different things with the case. And then after that, if all goes well, you receive your offer, and then now the tables kind of turn. Instead of you recruiting for the firm and you trying to impress yourself upon the firm, now the firm is trying to impress themselves upon you. And there's lots of opportunities to kind of discern and see whether the firm is the right place for you in terms of like a welcome weekend. There's often dinners, and current employees will be reaching out to you to offer themselves as a resource. Just a couple notes. Our recommendation is to apply widely. There's a lot of outstanding companies out there, and this can be a pretty competitive process. And so it definitely helps to apply widely, not only to understand more about the industry and understand more about what exactly the consulting field looks like, but also just get more practice. Every interview you get, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to an offer, is helping you for the next interview that you're going to have. And especially throughout this process, and it's important to kind of make sure you don't get too bogged down in any one firm's decision, because it is such a competitive process that it essentially becomes a crapshoot or a lottery at a certain point. Timelines and processes, again, vary firm to firm. There can be an application deadline. It can be rolling or non-rolling in the sense of they offer interviews as a reapplication, so they only start reading at a certain point and then offer interviews. The time in between interviews can vary. And honestly, you can get offers as early as late August and as late as late November. And that's just a function of kind of the way that the industry rolls. And one cool thing, or one slightly nerve-wracking thing, is like you can expect a call for either type of news, positive or negative, post-interview. So just keep that in mind. And I think kind of as a last note too, it's also important to use interviews as an opportunity to learn more about the firm, especially for final round interviews. You get to go into the office and interact with the current employees and the partners there. And really that I think is an opportunity to see if that's a place you want to spend the next however many years of your career, growing, learning, developing, and really kind of providing value to society. With that, some final reflections. One thing that, kind of looking back on my recruiting process, and well, I don't know if you can kind of speak to this as well, but going through it all, I was very surprised at how the recruiting process is a very, very intensely personal one at most firms, in the sense of it can sometimes feel like you're just sending out, it's not, you're not yourself. You're reducing yourself to a set of, your GPA, a set of numbers, a set of accomplishments on a piece of paper, and then handing that in, and you're just lost into kind of the void and the ether of the recruiting portal. But I remember being struck over and over again how many people at each one of these firms I was applying to knew me, knew what I was interested in, knew what I wanted to do. I had personal relationships with recruiters at most of the firms, and after I did end up getting the offer at the firm I was working at, there were so many people who were immediately psyched and reached out to me, and were so happy for me. This is a personal process in the sense that people get to know you throughout the recruiting process, and don't take that for granted. It's really an opportunity, I think, if you will, to meet some outstanding people who can often be your lifelong friends once the recruiting process is over. And it's also an opportunity to gain so much more, in the sense of you're learning more about yourself, you're learning more about what you want to be doing, you're learning more about consulting, you're learning more about kind of business in general and how exactly your education can kind of fit into creating greater value for society. And then along the way, I think the case interview process is particularly instructive and particularly rewarding in the sense that you can be cultivating your critical thinking and gaining some applicable skills. Some of the math skills that I learned, mental math that I learned from consulting case prep, has still served me well today. And as a last note, I think keep everything in perspective. I know sometimes it can feel like a rat race almost, where you're constantly applying from one company after another, and especially during the fall, it can seem very intense to be jumping from call to call, interview to interview. Just keep everything in perspective, in the sense that you're at Boston College. We have a lot of privilege that comes with us, but it's also privilege that we've earned, and things generally are gonna work out just fine. One company's rejection is not necessarily a referendum on your self-worth at all. And there is the right company out there for you that's going to be able to provide the best fit for your skills and for what you can bring.
And if I can just add, through this entire recruiting process, it does often feel like you are very heavily pursuing companies, pursuing a place to work. But it's also important to remember, and this is sort of speaks to what Harry was saying about it being a personal process, these companies want you, and they want to bring you in and to have you be part of their firm. So just remember that through all of it as well, because you're not just entering a machine, you're becoming part of a community. And that can be very reassuring and can be a healthy way to look at things as well.
Yeah, awesome. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you have any questions, please let us know.